Hello.
Hi.
Cool. All right. I'm Leon.
I'm Aryam,
I'm Kevin.
and so for the past week, the past 5 days, we have been doing experiments and learning topics and concepts in the field of nanoscience. And the reason why it is actually important to learn these concepts is that nanoscience has a big part in the future of technological innovation. And yeah, it's a really big field, and it's important to learn that.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything from the computer chips in your phone to the sensors in your car is impacted by advancements in this field. So our picture is about a fun little thing called plasmonics. Now, plasmonics is a phenomenon that occurs with metals because metals have a large number of basically, like quasi-free electrons, and that's what allows this phenomenon to occur. So essentially, when a wavelength of light hits an electron cloud that surrounds a nanoparticle, it oscillates the electrons, and there's a specific frequency at which that oscillation will turn into resonance, and that frequency is dependent on the size, shape, composition, and refractive index of the surrounding materials of the nanoparticle. And that frequency is extremely important because
When the electron starts vibrating at that frequency, it will appear to be the color that is complementary to the color that's actually hitting the electron.
And that's because if the wavelength of light that hits those electrons is the correct wavelength dictated by those factors previously mentioned, then that wavelength of light will be absorbed.
Okay, so our drawing that we were given shows a game show that aired a while back, and it is called A Hole in the Wall. And three contestants would stand next to a pool of water, while a wall with holes with a specific shape and size would start moving towards them. And so the contestants would have to contort themselves into the shape of that hole so that the wall would actually pass through them and not push them in the water. And so it shows these three different contestants. This contestant number one, it's really hard to see, but that says height right there, and he is 7 feet tall. The other two contestants, contestants 2 and 3, are both 5'5", and contestants 1 and 2 are 130 pounds, while contestant 3 is 300 pounds. And as you can see later on, the wall pushes through. Contestant 2 is fine because he is exactly the right height and weight needed to be able to contort and fill the shape of the wall, while the other two end up getting splashed in the water. Contestant 1, who doesn't weigh a lot, makes a little splash, while contestant 2, who does weigh a lot, makes a big splash.
So the contestants in this metaphor are representative of nanoparticles, and the wall that's approaching them is the light. In order for them to appear the certain color, then they have to be the right shape and size in order to either pass through the light or transmit through the light or scatter the light.
Yeah, and so as you can see, so contestants 1 and 3 represent how contestant 1 was too tall and contestant 3 was too wide, and you can see that only contestant 2, which represents a very specific wavelength, only a specific nanoparticle, sorry, can pass through that specific wavelength. The holes are wavelengths of light, and the nanoparticle gets absorbed right there, that's what it represents. The contestant 2 actually going through the hole, while contestants 1 and 3 actually fall down. And there was another concept that was described here, and that was that contestant 1 made a little splash while contestant 3 made a big splash. And in real life, obviously the person who would weigh more would make a bigger splash. But in the field of nanoscience, that represents scattering, which is a big splash, versus transmitting. And so certain nanoparticles transmit through wavelengths of light, while others scatter. And so the bigger person was the scattering nanoparticles, while the taller person was the transmitting nanoparticles.
All right, so for some little constructive criticisms, this was a pretty good analogy of, a fun game show, and most of these concepts are very well represented. The only thing that was a little strange was that the contestants, who we believed were nanoparticles, were actually pushed by the light, which is not exactly representative of the phenomenon described by Plasmonics. In addition, in our experiment, we made these nanoparticles out of gold using a process where we put a beaker on a hot plate and we had a stirrer in there. And if we left it on the hot plate too long, the nanoparticles would clump together and form much, much larger structures. And that concept is not represented here, but it could be something that could be worked in to more completely represent this phenomenon. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so 2 comments. First, I just want to remind people that it's not constructive criticism. It's an analysis of the limitations of the cartoon, and they all have limitations. But that is just a slightly different language. Every analogy has limitations, and that's just built into it. And so it's analyzing just that whole idea. So try to use that language when you're talking about this. The second comment, I just have to ask the audience, does this game show really exist? Yes. This is a sad statement about television today, but okay. That aside, we will now open the floor for questions.
Hi, can I just ask what the purpose of the experiment is? Is it to identify specific materials using light, or is it to manipulate those materials somehow and transform them into other particles?
So the purpose of this experiment was really a demonstration of this phenomenon, but if you're asking what applications we could use this phenomenon for, plasmonics can be used to amplify lasers, for example. So it could be used in sort of trying to create a more powerful laser that is also extremely small, since this phenomenon is happening at the nanoscale. However, I don't think that application is widespread. It was only briefly mentioned in a lecture that we saw. And aside from that, we created gold nanospheres and gold nanostars, just different shaped nanoparticles, using methods involving the stir table, which has heat and a stir. And that was really just a demonstration of the phenomenon.
So there was, just I guess as a follow-up, so there was one application that I did mention that was really big in terms of possible medical applications for gold nanospheres that does very specifically use the phenomenon of plasmonic resonance. Do you remember what that was, and can you explain a little bit about it?
Yes, it was a cancer treatment. I believe it's not in clinical trials yet. I'm not 100% sure. But essentially, gold nanoparticles would be injected into an area that had a tumor, and then using UV light, which is in the biological window, meaning it can pass through biological.
Near IR light, but close.
Not UV.
Near
oh,
IR.
sorry. Infrared. One of the ends of the visible light spectrum. It's close. It can pass through biological tissue without damaging it. UV will definitely damage it, but the infrared rays will pass through the biological tissue to where the tumor would be, and they would use certain biological mechanisms like antigens to make sure the gold nanoparticles target the cancer cell, and then the infrared light would heat up those nanoparticles so that it would kill the cancer cells.
Yeah. But so the big concept, 30,000-foot view, is that after these metal nanoparticles absorb light, they absorb really strongly, so they make things colored, but then they dump that energy as heat. So it's a good way to convert light to heat, which is useful for some things. Yeah. Okay, one more question. Okay. Ty.
So I just wanted to ask, you talked about in the lab, you saw that the gold nanoparticles clump together after a while when you're heating them and stuff. Is there a way that you can make those nanoparticles not clump together? I mean, I know there is because we did it in lab, but can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, you can use a capping agent that will keep them separated from each other, and so they won't clump together.
Yeah, and so those are things intrinsically in this analogy you can't put together, the clumping or the capping. Those are things that just aren't a part of this analogy. I did want to make one more comment. So you said, well, light doesn't really push on the nanoparticles the way a wall does, but light actually does push on the electrons. When I talk about it, I use that technical term, slosh. It pushes the electrons back and forth. So maybe that would be another actual connection between the cartoon and the real system. Okay, let's thank these guys for another good talk. Okay, sorry.